It's been over a year and a half since I last attempted the pencil guitar concept, so it's time for another rendition. I built my first pencil guitar over 7 years ago, and my designs have evolved over the years, so in this video, I'm going to try to cover the advancements I've made in design and process. Thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video, more on that later. First one, I actually cut all 1200 pencils on a tiny Harbor Freight chop saw, and I've been fortunate to upgrade my equipment over the years, so I obviously have a more efficient process nowadays. Before I build this guitar, I've got to make a blank out of the pencils. And for this one, I'm making a V pattern design, sort of like a chevron V pattern. So there's two molds for each half of the blank. They're shaped like parallelograms so that when I join the two halves later, it'll give that V pattern I'm after. I'm doing the top and bottom layers in black, red, and white pencils only. I've always liked the idea of having more distinct colors and aesthetics to these builds, but it's nearly impossible to get large quantities of individual colors, so the middle of the guitar will basically just have a rainbow of colors. This guitar is a commissioned project, and I don't generally take on many commissions because I've got a bunch of different ideas and not a ton of time for commissions. The thing with commissions is that they're generally a replication or some sort of variation of something I've already built, which is to be expected. But as long as the client is willing to give me some degree of creative freedom with the build, I can generally think of new patterns or techniques to try out on these builds, which makes it more engaging for me and for you, the viewer. I think this is my fifth pencil guitar, and at this point I feel like I've got the process for building these guitars down pretty good. The first one was built with the pencils vertically stacked on end to create the blank, and it looked cool. Some people with trypophobia may not have enjoyed the look, but it's also the weakest orientation possible. I did do a strength test on the vertical orientation, and it's actually quite strong. I couldn't break it, but aesthetically I think different orientations look better. So I then tried making one with the pencils at an angle, kind of similar to the vertical, but it should be a lot stronger in theory. And it just gave a more stretched look to the pencils. And after that, I switched to laying the pencils flat, which is the strongest orientation. And most recently I did a base with pencils laying flat, but I laminated it in sort of a burst pattern. So that's the evolution of the pencil orientation on these builds. There's a lot more advancements I've made on the process as a whole, which I'll get into a bit throughout this video. Mix up some thickset resin and pour it into the molds. This stuff cures over a few days, so it's a relatively slow curing resin, which is ideal for this type of pour considering it's a fairly thick blank. Let it cure for a couple days, and then I pop them out of their molds, and now we can see the first look of the pattern with a V shape. Run the top side of the blanks through the planer. It's important to keep a single reference point on these blanks, so I always use the bottom side as the reference. With the runners holding them down during the glue up, the bottom side should be perfectly flat with all of the pencils on an even plane, and that bottom side will be the reference point for all of my planing going forward. I didn't plane the blanks down enough to get to the pencil leads yet, just removed enough material to get both sides level with each other. Cleaned up the inside edge on the table saw so that I can get a nice clean joint when I join these two halves together. I used some high performance resin to join the two halves. I've used wood glue before and also resin. It doesn't really matter, both do a good job of bonding the material, but I like to use resin since it gives me a much longer working time to get it joined correctly compared to wood glue. Both do a good job of bonding it, so this is really just preference. Laying the pencils down perfectly during the mold process is one of the most important parts of these builds. It can be tedious, but getting them laid out correctly gives a perfect pattern on the pencils with no gaps or weird offset pencils, and it ends up giving a look like this on the sides. If you get one warped pencil, it can throw off the entire design, and each consecutive layer will have larger and larger gaps, so setting up the pencils correctly in the initial stages is super important for getting a clean look on the finished piece. Now I can run the joined blank through the planer using the bottom side as the reference point again. I take off material here very slowly so that I can be sure of where each pencil is in terms of depth. This is kind of a fairly nerve-wracking process in these projects, just because it's easy, if you're not paying close attention to your depths, to take off too much material and accidentally plane through the first layer of the pencil leads. And since only the top and bottom layer have the pattern, it would be a disaster if I accidentally planed through the leads. So it's really important that I'm just taking very, very thin passes through the planer and checking checking where the leads are at after every pass. Fortunately, I was able to get all the leads to show through on both sides before running out of depth. Now I'm just using a razor blade to scrape the surface, which cleans up the wood and gets rid of any color bleeding that may have happened throughout the planing process. Seal the top of the blank with some high performance resin before I do a flood coat on it. If I didn't do this before the flood coat, I would just end up with a bunch of bubbles, which would not be ideal. On the first two variations of the pencil guitars, I didn't use a flood coat at all, and because of that, it's a lot harder to get a perfect finish. I had to spray on a ton of layers of clear coat to get all the wood to seal and to fill any imperfections, and that ends up being like 10 to 15 coats of clear, which is a lot. It ends up being a lot easier to get a perfect finish on these guitars if I just flood coat the top and bottom prior to cutting out the shape of the guitar body. So unfortunately, I've got some bubbles in the flood coat. For some reason, they're only here near the middle rear portion of the blank. Some of them are spots where I could probably place the neck and pickup cavities, but not all of them. So I gotta try and fill these bubbles and hope that makes them disappear. I've never really had to deal with this problem on any of my previous builds, so I ended up using a small drill bit to drill through each bubble to open them up, using the depth stop on the drill press to make sure that I'm not drilling into the pencil layer, vacuumed out the debris from the holes, and then I used a tiny needle syringe to fill the bubbles from the inside. First time trying this, and it ended up working as well as I could have hoped for. Got all the bubbles filled. A little tedious, but I basically had to try it. Gotta let them cure, then I'll plane back the entire surface to level off the excess. Anytime I finish one of these pencil guitars, I end up with some amount of leftover pencils. These are the leftovers from this guitar. The problem with colored pencils is that different brands have different diameters to them, so you can't mix and match pencils really. So here in the shop, they just sort of accumulate. And if I'm being honest, the same thing happens with my subscriptions. And while this video sponsor, Rocket Money, can't help with my ever-growing pencil collection, it does help me find and cancel subscriptions I'm not using, tracks my spending, and sets up budgets all in one place. This is my complete and ever-growing collection of other random pencils, if you were wondering how many I actually have. I'm subscribed to a lot of different software to run this business, and tracking all of them can be difficult, but with Rocket Money, it automatically pulls in all your active subscriptions and makes it easy to cancel the ones you don't actually need with just a few taps. And finally, here's my collection of colored pencil blank scraps, which I've probably got enough to make some sort of Frankenstein guitar out of it. Rocket Money will automatically scan your bills to find savings, and with just a couple of taps, Rocket Money can help negotiate your bills for you, from internet service to cable and phone bills, all things I use to run my business. There's no need to worry about customer service calls. Let the app's negotiators go to work for you to try to get the best possible rate. Rocket Money helps me keep the shop a little bit more efficient, at least on the financial side of things. To try Rocket Money out today and unlock more features with premium, head to rocketmoney.com/brillsart or click the link in the video description. Thanks again to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. All right, another issue here. Had a little piece of pencil lead chip out during the planing. I cut this little piece of lead out of a new pencil, and I'm gonna try to fit it in the gap. Never had to deal with this either, so I'm just kind of experimenting with this. That's burning the wood a bit, not good. Kind of the caveman solution to this. Not perfect, but it's filled. Maybe a little more scraping will help. For the body shape, I'm doing something that I figured out on my previous pencil guitar build, which is to take the body template that I'm gonna use and create an additional template of it that's downsized roughly 1/8 of an inch. I'm using a little trim router bit that's made for routing a binding for a guitar body, and it works well to downsize a template. Then I drilled 2 pilot holes through both templates, which will allow me to use a 3/4 inch dowel to attach these templates to the blank, and doing it this way keeps both templates positioned exactly the same. The purpose of using 2 templates to create the body is that I can cut out the pencil blank with the smaller template first, and then flood coat the sides of the guitar body, reattach the larger template, and use that to route the body out again. It's more work to do it this way, but the end result is so much cleaner. I mentioned earlier how on my third pencil guitar build, I began flood coating the tops and bottoms of the guitar bodies, but I wasn't flood coating the sides, so the sides of the body still required a ton of coats of clear in order to get a decent finish. On my last pencil build, I switched to this method, which essentially ends up casting the entire body, including the sides, in resin, which gives a way better surface quality to the sides, where I can pretty much get a perfect finish on the entire body. I added a chamfer to the top and bottom of the body. I'd usually go for a roundover instead of a chamfer. I think Fenders have an 1/8 inch roundover on Telecasters, but I thought the chamfer would look good on this body given the V-style pattern on the top and bottom. Drew on my belly cut, which isn't standard on a typical Fender Telecaster, but I like to have belly carves on my guitars. Plus, I think the belly carves look cool on the pencil builds since you end up with a kind of like a warped pencil appearance that looks almost fake. Smooth out the carve with a palm sander to get its shape finalized. Sanding does smear the colors around and you end up with the pencil wedges turning brown. So I've got to get in there with a razor blade after and scrape the surface back to recover the original wood color. Tape comes off and the back is now almost ready to get flood coated once again. Here I'm cutting a sheet of corrugated plastic into strips, and then I'll use that to create a mold for the final flood coat. This stuff works really well to make simple molds because it bends well, and because it's corrugated, I can form it into place using nails and it'll hold its shape. I made this mold just slightly larger than the template, which is now the larger of the two templates. Gotta tape off the seam so it'll be sealed from the inside. And then I realized that I shaped the form backwards, so I need to flip the entire template so that the face of the guitar will be positioned down. Got it set up correctly, and then I sealed off the inside of the edge with silicone. I put a few dabs of glue under the guitar body so that it won't float when I pour the flood coat. Also, at this point, I already sealed the sides and back of the guitar with high performance resin. Flood coat goes on, which will end up filling in over the belly carve, so that'll have to get recarved again later. I've thought about putting a plug-in over the belly carve so that I wouldn't have to recarve it, but there's just a good chance that I'd end up with bubbles there since the air wouldn't be able to just float out to the surface. For the neck on this guitar, I had a really nice piece of flame maple that I've been holding on to for the right project, so I finally decided to use that. This is roasted maple. The necks on these pencil builds is another part of the guitar that has evolved over the years. First pencil guitar build was my first guitar build ever, and so I ended up just using a Squier neck on it since I didn't even know how to build guitar necks at that point. And then over the next few pencil builds, I began building my own necks out of wood. On version 4, I made the entire guitar, including the neck, out of pencils, and while it looks neat, I ultimately went back to using maple necks because I just think there's a distinct feel to a wooden guitar neck that is really unbeatable. I've built guitar necks out of all different kinds of things at this point: pencils, aluminum, bronze, and nothing to me feels as good as just a classic maple guitar neck. Here I drop down a portion of the headstock so that I can laminate some pencils into it. I just glue them in and then route over the tops of them to bring them down to the pencil leads. And this is just a small feature, but it ties in the overall theme of the guitar to the neck as well. Dual action truss rod gets installed. I went with an ebony fretboard on this neck, and that's what I'm laminating here. Scraping down the pencils to clean them up, and then I flood coat them. Essentially doing this portion on the headstock the exact same way I did the body. And then I can route the headstock to the final depth and get the shape cut out on the bandsaw. On most of my builds, I don't use fret dot markers on the face of the fretboards just because I like the more simple and clean look. But on pencil builds, I think it's a good opportunity to once again add into the overall theme of the guitar by using pencils for the dot markers. Tuner holes get drilled out, and I'm going to be using vintage style tuners on this guitar, which I don't usually use, but I think they'll fit this neck well aesthetically, especially because I'm going with a more vintage Tele style neck carve on this, which feels just a bit more chunky than a more modern Fender neck. Added some fretboard oil onto the ebony before fretting. I use stainless steel on almost all of my necks simply because it lasts longer than nickel. I I use these fret end nippers to cut off the ends of the tangs on each fret before I press them into place. I've been doing this for a while now, and it's just a small detail, and it allows me to cover the fret ends from the side of the fretboard, once again just leaving a cleaner overall look to the neck. Stainless steel also polishes better than nickel, and it holds its shine longer, which is a nice aesthetic attribute, I guess. To hide the fret ends, I basically just sand the edge of the fretboard with 220 grit, and every once in a while I'll stop and add a bit of super glue into the slots, and then I go back to sanding the edge. And I just repeat this until the slots are completely filled with ebony dust. And once I finish sanding the edges and apply some oil, the slots are nearly invisible. Then it's just some general fretwork to do on the neck, which is by far the most time-intensive process of the neck build, but also the most important part of making the neck feel good and play right. And I usually just gloss over this process in the videos, but it does take a fairly long time to get it where I want it. I used a hard wax oil for the finish, just wipe it on with my hands and then come back like 15 minutes later and wipe it off with a towel. It does a really good job of bringing out the wood grain and leaves a nice satin finish that feels really good. I'm not a huge fan of super glossy necks, so this finish is more my style, and it's pretty simple to apply. I got my two body templates, and you can see the size difference between the two. It's just like an 1/8 inch difference. So this will leave me with an 1/8 inch layer of resin around the sides of the guitar, and that ends up just looking like a really thick clear coat. This is the least fun part of the build because it's just a lot of routing, and I basically just put on a Tyvek suit, close up the tent, and go to work with the router all day for this part. We've got this outdoor tent area set up where we do most of our heavy carving or cutting or grinding at. Basically anything that can't get hooked up to a dust collector just to keep the shop area more clean. It does a good job of containing the waste, and then at the end of the day I just go through with a vacuum and vacuum everything up. Gotta sand down the whole guitar, make sure everything is nice and smooth, and here you can clearly see how the whole body is essentially just cast in resin. Add the chamfer to the body again, which matches it with the chamfer on the pencils. Then just get to routing out all the pockets for the electronics and neck. I'm using a humbucker for the neck pickup, so I'm using a different template to add that. Gotta recarve the belly cut with a grinder. It's not that hard to see where the pencils are, but obviously I don't want to end up carving too deep because then I risk the chance of removing the flood coat altogether. So ultimately, the reason I do the flood coat on the sides is because it gives a cleaner look, but it's really mostly because it saves a bunch of time with the finish. For every guitar I build, the part that takes the longest time is achieving a good finish. With the body being essentially cast at this point, I really only need to sand down the body with 220 grit and then apply a clear coat. It is possible to sand the resin up to a fine grit and then polish the resin to get a good finish, but that takes way more time and you'll never achieve as high of a gloss as you would with a quality clear coat. What I typically use is a 2K urethane, which is sold in a can with a catalyzer built in that you have to break before use. These cans are really expensive, and I end up using almost a full can for one guitar body. They're made for clear coating car parts, and they are extremely toxic, especially since they contain isocyanates, so using a supplied air respirator is best for this. I've got a spray gun set up, and I've used that in the past, but the cans are way easier to use and I don't have to clean them afterwards. Plus, I'm only spraying a handful of times a year, so it just ends up being a lot easier this way. Now I've just got to get this guitar polished and assembled together. It's going to get a Seymour Duncan Vintage 54 in the bridge and an Alnico 2 Pro humbucker in the neck. So that's pretty much all that's gone into my evolution on these pencil builds over the years. All of my secrets on how I do it, which aren't really secrets considering I've documented all of these improvements or changes over the years. As I mentioned earlier, this guitar is a commissioned project, so it's not up for sale, but I do have a number of guitars and other pieces listed for sale on my site. The link to that will be in the description. I'll play a demo on this at the end of the video here shortly. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll be back again soon with a new project. All right, hold up. I just noticed something, and I'm adding the finishing touches to this video right now, and I just caught this. I can't believe I didn't notice this earlier, but check this out. There's a black pencil where there should be a red, and there's a red pencil where there should be a black. And I can't say I'm surprised I did that, but I am a little surprised I didn't catch it until now. Guitar's long gone to its new home at this point. Not that there's really anything I could have done about it anyways. Just can't build anything perfect. I'll call it my signature touch. Yeah, that's all. Just wanted to call myself out before any of you do.
Mm-hmm.